you all for joining us for Digital Dangers, a conversation about student journalists and online harassment. I have just a couple of items that I want to get through first as we give folks a few more moments to join, and then we'll get to the conversation. So my name is Josh Moore. I'm the Assistant Director of the Student Press Law Center. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, the Student Press Law Center is the nation's only nonprofit organization devoted to providing legal support and training to student journalists, as well as to advocating for their First Amendment and free press rights. Each year, we organize Student Press Freedom Day as an opportunity to celebrate the important role that student journalists play in our communities, as well as to highlight the challenges they face from censorship or online harassment or otherwise, and hopefully take actions to address those challenges and advance student press freedom. We want to thank the American Press Institute for being a sponsor of Student Press Freedom Day, as well as more than 35 other organizations that have sponsored or partnered with us to celebrate student press freedom this year. We have several events coming up, both SPLC sponsored or from one of those other partner organizations over the next couple of weeks. So we hope you'll check those events out as well. You can learn more about those at studentpressfreedom.org/events. And throughout tonight's conversation, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to use the Zoom's Q&A feature. If we don't get to your question during the conversation itself, we'll try to leave a bit of time at the end for those questions. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Pratika Katiyar. She is the student member of SPLC's Board of Directors and a student at Northeastern University in Boston. She already has a longer list of accomplishments than most of us, so I will probably leave it there, except to say that I know, Pratika, that you've written specifically about how online harassment makes the press less free. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Pratika?
Yes, thank you, Josh. I just want to introduce our panelists. We have Sarah, who is a climate and environmental reporter at the Greenville News. She previously worked at AL.com as a gender and politics reporter, and she graduated from Kennesaw State University with a degree in journalism and worked at the Center for Sustainable Journalism there. And then Taylor Lorenz, who needs no introduction, is a journalist at the Washington Post. She's a technology reporter there, and she was previously a tech reporter for the New York Times, the Daily Beast, Business Insider, and a bunch of other places. And she specifically specializes in internet culture, and her national best-selling book that was recently released is called Extremely Online. And I am the student board member, as Josh said, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So without further ado, I want to get into it. Thank you so much, Taylor and Sarah, for joining us. My first question is for Sarah. I am curious to hear kind of your experiences as both when you were a student journalist and then going into the professional role as a reporter. How have you navigated and dealt with online harassment personally? And this tends to be a more sensitive topic, so feel free to share as little or as much as you'd like.
So when I was a student journalist, I primarily covered State House adjacent topics. None of them were all that crazy polarized, so I didn't really deal with a whole lot of interaction when I was a student journalist. I went to Report for America and was placed at AL.com in Birmingham as a gender and politics reporter. So I was going to be covering the State House. And we all kind of had some idea that that was going to be a challenging role from the get-go, given the nature of the job and where it was. So we did our best to try and prepare for it. I had really fantastic mentors in college that were very close with me throughout the application process. And so I talked with them pretty extensively. We did not realize the depth and intensity of what it was going to look like. So I will do my best to keep it pretty brief. But basically, I announced the job on Twitter, and it kind of went semi-viral, and people were not thrilled. So that first week was a little bit of just kind of figuring out how to handle that and how to handle that much attention, period. So I struggled a good bit, not taking that to heart, but it was mostly just mean comments. I wouldn't say it was like anything particularly dangerous, so very unpleasant, but not threatening. I started the job in June, and I got my first death threat in September. And I didn't know what to do. I was really taken aback by it. When I talked to my HR department, they pretty much just said there's nothing we can do. And my editors didn't really do a whole lot. Things were relatively calm until January, and then I put together an online form for people to be able to tell me about what was going on, tell me about how they were responding to my work. I think it was about 10 questions. And so I used Microsoft Forms because that was what our company used, and it doesn't track any kind of email addresses or anything like that. So there were a couple people that, again, said some rude things, but someone got a hold of that form and started filling out the form. And I'm not going to go into detail, but death threats on every question, a different kind. And so they did that once, and then they continued to stalk my Twitter. And so they would fill out another form with information that they had gathered. I tweeted something about watching New Girl, and then they went and filled out the form and said something about me watching New Girl. So just like very clear that they were paying attention. And so they continued to submit it. Finally, my HR department was like, well, we can't really figure out what to do about it, so maybe just turn it off. Turn the form off. They started signing a bunch of petitions in my name. They found my personal email address and used that. They started trying to find my personal social accounts and basically just chase those down. So long story short, it was a several month thing. And it got to a point where I had mentors that were basically telling me, like, you've got to go, you cannot stay here. And so after a while, I kind of realized that it wasn't going to get better and had to step away. So I left that job in May of 2023 and transitioned to my current job at the Greenville News, where I cover climate, which people are also not excited about, but to a far lesser degree. So it's a lot more mentally calm, I guess, comparatively to what things looked like in Alabama.
You know, I mean, I think that's so upsetting, but I feel like it's such a common occurrence these days, especially with women journalists, like being driven out of their roles, their field, just because of the nature of the online world, but the need to be online as well to promote your work and to kind of have that personal brand. Taylor, you have a huge platform, and I mean, I've heard you briefly talk about this, and you're really vocal online about your experiences, but could you maybe talk about how you balance having such a large platform with the inevitable nature of online harassment that kind of comes with that?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that having a big platform necessarily comes with harassment because a lot of male journalists have even bigger platforms than I do, and they never receive even a fraction of what I get. And I think that there's such a focus, like the type of harassment is so misogynistic that that's the issue too. I mean, literally, then the first 2 seconds of us signing on here, I just watched some big YouTuber has made a video of me saying like, I should be put in a retirement home or whatever. There's an obsession with my age and my looks and my appearance and obviously I'm like a conventionally looking sort of like white woman, and other people get it worse in different ways, based on their race. But I also do think there's a particular type of misogyny towards women that are sort of seen as attractive but don't fit into their sort of maybe ideas of what gender should be or whatever. But yeah, I think I'm so grateful that I have my platform. I think my platform has really inoculated me against some of the worst of it. I mean, I think of what I went through at the New York Times and what colleagues of mine went through at the New York Times, especially. I know one woman pretty well who was a woman of color who was had also written about a big right-wing influencer and was dealing with, horrific harassment and had her family targeted. in that case, I'm not sure if her parents were citizens or not, but it was, it was, the stakes are so much higher, and she doesn't have a very big following on the internet. And so, I think that the institution can then exploit her. And sometimes I feel like the institutions that I work for at least have to take me seriously because they know that I have such big a platform. It kind of like balances the power dynamic out a little bit. Whereas I've seen the way they treat other women that are targeted that aren't as much public figures. They're taken off their beats, reassigned, they're demoted, they're maligned, they're seen as problems, and they're eventually or very quickly pushed out of the industry. So at least I feel like by developing my own, and I had an audience, I mean, I was an internet person before I was a journalist, but like, at least it's kind of protected me because I can go on the internet and say something and I have followers that will support me. And so that's very valuable. But it's hard. And I don't think I could have amassed that audience. Like, the climate today has changed so much. Like, I mean, even what Sarah was saying, like such horrible stories, but like, I'm in my 30s, and like, I'm a millennial, and I started in media a decade ago, and there wasn't this like politicization of journalism in the way there is now. And it's very corrosive. I think it's a huge threat to press freedom.
And speaking of press freedom, I think given this is Student Press Freedom Day and we want to center the younger journalists, the aspiring journalists, I think that online harassment is just so pervasive that people are facing it at an earlier point in their careers. My question for you, Sarah, is just if you have any advice for student journalists who are facing this, whether they're in college or getting out of college, early career, given that sometimes newsrooms and universities don't often prepare students for this type of problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wrote down a couple of things. It's different for everybody. I know I say worked for me, like it wasn't great, but I did what I could. I think one of the biggest things that you can do to try and prepare yourself as much as possible, because again, like I said, I had mentors that spoke with me about kind of what we thought we could expect, but where I think I really would have benefited had I had talked to other people who were focused on gender or had written a lot of stories on gender, specifically located in the Deep South, to maybe understand a little bit of what people saw in their work and their how they engaged with their work, because we didn't have, like, essentially it was like a lack of data. We didn't have it. So we couldn't kind of draw from it. So I would say first and foremost, whatever beat you're going into, whatever geographic region you're going into, finding people that have been in similar situations that can maybe speak a little bit to what they've gone through can be really, really helpful in figuring out how to best prepare. That said, I do not think there's anything you can do to properly prepare for those kinds of situations. I think something that's become really important to me, as I've kind of said, my newsroom was not supportive. It was very similar to what Taylor was just talking about. I didn't have a large following, so I was very much just kind of pushed aside and essentially pushed out of that newsroom. And so for me, something that's become really important is when I was interviewing for different jobs, I would ask, kind of without going into too much detail, like, how would you respond if a reporter was put in this situation? What would your response be? What would your priorities be? And how would you handle this? So knowing how editors and how newsroom leadership would respond, and kind of having something to essentially hold them accountable should you run into that situation, has become a really important structure for me when I'm kind of navigating where to go. I would also say trying to prepare yourself ahead of time in terms of ways that you'll deal with it. So let's say that's a support system, that's setting up therapy, that is going for runs, which was a big one for me. I started running a whole lot, and I had friends that I made through running that held me accountable in that way. Finding out how you're going to try to combat the negativity that's going to come from situations like that is really big, so that you don't end up isolated and alone and then trying to figure it out from there, because like it gets so draining and it gets so heavy, it can be really difficult to pull yourself out of that. So trying to prepare in advance in terms of ways that you can cope with that level of negativity, which again, you can only do so much, but having those set habits, I think, was really helpful. I also wrote down becoming familiar with your health insurance. If you are employed somewhere that does give you health insurance, see what mental health options are available to you before you need them. There can be waiting lists. It can take a lot of time. Again, you don't want to get into a situation where you're trying to do those things when you're kind of in a pit. So just doing as much as you can to set yourself up to deal with negativity before the negativity comes. You're never going to be able to adjust how you'll feel when it happens, but you can adjust the support systems that you've set up for yourself. I think it's important to talk to a lot of other journalists. I also think it's important to try and find hobbies and things outside of journalism that can draw you out of it, because if you're only around journalists, that's kind of going to just keep you in an echo chamber. So having a healthy balance of people who can understand what you're going through and people that can kind of bring out the other parts of you is really important, because at the end of the day, journalism is amazing, but it is a career and you are a person before you are a journalist. So I think for me, it was really easy to get bogged down in just thinking like of myself through that particular lens. So all of that to say, it's a pretty robust lineup of things, and I have even more written down that I don't even think I'll get to, but I think trying to reframe it from preparing yourself for the harassment, and instead thinking of it as like preparing your toolkit for when you are dealing with negativity, whether that's harassment or something else, because there are a ton of different forms of negativity in the journalism world. I think that's probably the most helpful strategy that I can give to student journalists, but just ask so many questions, and don't be afraid to hold people's feet to the fire when it comes to asking what strategies are going to be in place to protect you and uplift you, because your job is not to take harassment. Your job is to report. So
I think that's a really good, like thoughtful list of kind of things that student journalists can do as they maybe prepare to take on a new role, or even within their own newsrooms to kind of think about what they might be dealing with. Taylor, you're one of the few reporters I know who seriously covered online harassment, but also specifically covered student journalists and like the online harassment that they face, and then also women and what they're facing with regards to press freedom issues. So I'm curious to see if there's any trends that you've seen while reporting when it comes to young journalists, what they're facing with regards to online harassment, and if you're thinking that this is becoming a more prominent issue that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I think it's becoming so significantly worse in ways that I didn't even anticipate even a few years ago. I mean, it's not only are they targeting journalists more intentionally now, student journalists, they target student journalists now in a way that they weren't even a few years ago, because I think that what these bad actors realize is that you can very successfully cut off people's careers early. As I said, I have a huge platform, I have connections, like I got successful before all of this stuff started happening to me. So it's much harder for them to kind of go after me as opposed to some of these younger women. I know multiple women that are, you know, young reporters under 25 who have just now they're not in journalism anymore because of the abuse that they received and the lack of support from their newsrooms. So I think it's really scary. And I think that we need institutions to get involved, because I don't think this can just be put on these young journalists. I don't blame any of them for not wanting to go into the field, but the ones that do want to go into the field are often driven out because opportunities are taken away by these newsroom leaders that live in another century and don't understand, you know, gender-based violence and things like that. And so I mean, I tell every young journalist, do not work in traditional media, like stay as far away as possible from traditional media as you can when you're young, because I think it puts a target on your back. And I think you're often working at the mercy of, not to be ageist, but older people, maybe older in terms of the mindset, at least, you know, they could be 30 years old and still in that mindset, who are going to throw you under the bus and not have your back. And at least if you work in a non-traditional media company, or it just doesn't, it doesn't usually have that same dynamic, even if you're also doing reporting. So yeah, I think these efforts have become a lot more coordinated, and it's not just what people think of as the death threats. I mean, I had this start happening to me, and now it's actually happened to, I heard from a college journalist who had the same thing happening to her, where for a while, every single person I quoted in my stories would be doxxed and targeted just for speaking to me for one of my stories. And so it was creating this chilling effect where people didn't want to speak to me or be quoted in a story of mine because they knew that this was going to happen. And now they've done it to this student journalist as well, where anytime people are talking to her now in this community, she's being targeted. Like they're harassing her sources. And again, that's just a way to cut people off from opportunities and sort of mess with their ability to do work. And there's of course no support for that. So these are things also that most men journalists never would even think of, you know, that just doesn't affect them as much. So there's so much misogyny, and also misogyny has just become completely normalized online in a way that I think it actually wasn't even a few years ago. Same thing with anti-LGBTQ violence and hate. Like there's so much, it's the level of homophobia and anti-trans stuff that you see online, like that was just socially not normalized even a few years ago. I think partially because of Elon's sort of normalization of it and just the way that the far right has gained power. It's bad. So yeah, I feel like just try to not work in a traditional media newsroom because they're so in the past about it and it's getting worse.
Going off of that, and this is for both of you, but we can start with Sarah. I'm curious to see or to hear kind of what you both think could be done in terms of technology. So like the technological solutions or the role of social media platforms in better protecting journalists. How can they maybe add in new features, or how can they better support journalists? Because currently the state of Twitter or X, or even Instagram and Meta's Facebook and Threads, I feel like all of them have these different problems with the platforms that they sometimes do exacerbate or like really facilitate online harassment. So we can start with you, Taylor, because I know you report a lot on big tech, but do you see any solutions in terms of the technology and the platforms that could better help combat online harassment?
There are so many solutions and they'll never do them. I mean, as I reported just last week, like Meta is openly saying that we're going to censor news content and any content that's deemed political or any commentary on social issues. Obviously, that's a very political decision in itself. And as I spoke to many content creators and journalists for that article, um, that's a problem for Black journalists and LGBTQ journalists and women journalists who their whole identity is politicized. And so, you know, I don't have any faith that I don't think this is yes, the platform should do a lot more in terms of user safety, in terms of giving users controls, limiting replies, making sure that, you know, they verify our identities. A lot of us deal with like copycats and stalking and stuff, responding to takedown requests when somebody's targeting, harassing us. Like these are all things they could do, and they choose time and time again not to do it because ultimately nobody's holding them accountable. Lawmakers don't care about this issue. The media itself doesn't care about this issue, like from a structural standpoint. So they have no incentive to change. So I think unless there's pressure on them, we see this with everything, by the way, like it's not going to help their business model. So they just don't care. But I would love to see them implement changes like all of those, just more user controls.
Yeah, Sarah, do you have any kind of thoughts or like features that you wish you maybe had when you were facing online harassment, or just things that you would like to see changed on social media platforms?
I definitely think Taylor was better to speak to that than I am, because I have a lot less solutions when it comes to technology. What I will say is that while social media tended to kind of be the magnet for people who were harassing me, they would usually use my email specifically. So they would find it through whatever social media platform, and then they would email me. So as far as like what could have been done differently, I honestly don't know. The difficult thing for me was that people tended to find me when it had nothing to do with journalism. So I know that the person who found me and used that form found me because I had asked for recommendations of outdoor activities in Alabama, and a lot of people commented, and I guess that brought it to that person's attention, and that's how they found me. So I think it was kind of difficult for me because like it didn't really matter what I did or what I said. Like if it got any kind of reach whatsoever, like they would still be able to find my information pretty quickly, especially in news, because when you click on the person's name who wrote an article, then there's their email. So I'm not really sure what could have been done differently in terms of social media. I can say that like there was, when I would ask for help a lot of the time, there was a lot of like, oh, we don't track that information, or we don't know how to get that information. So had there been more options in terms of like IP address tracking or something like that, I really don't know. Had there been more options there, had people been more willing to assist there, if there were options, I think that would have been really beneficial. I can tell you that a lot of the time I reported something, it got denied. So just anybody paying better attention to that would have been beneficial. But kind of like Taylor said, like I think there's a lot of things that I wish were different, and I think to some extent, like I don't foresee them being implemented with the current business strategy of social media. And I hate ending on that because it's such a downer, but unfortunately, like people, when I took something away, or when I kind of tried to close the gap in how they could contact me or reach me, they would still find a way, and they would just try something else. So I think it's hard. Just honestly, I think it's really difficult to figure out how to be online and be online well without kind of attracting that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that there's so much with there's social media platforms that are trying to do like cater to all these different audiences, and journalists just unfortunately are not always the priority there. And it's really sad because of how much journalism relies on social media right now. Um, and so kind of going into the for students and like how they can learn to deal with this or be prepared as they enter the journalism world, how can universities better prepare? Like, are there trainings or classes, even, or just better facilities and resources that they can offer to student journalists? Um, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Sarah, on what universities could potentially do.
Absolutely. One of the things that I said a lot, and this is kind of a hard balance to find, because I got a lot of really great knowledge from the professors that I had in college, but all of them were about 2 decades ahead of me in terms of journalism. So the scope of it looked absolutely nothing like what the scope of it looks like right now in terms of how social media affects it. I think that that's a hard balance to find, because that means that people who are currently involved in that need to either be teaching classes or giving information to the people who teach those courses. So I think that there needs to be kind of more of a current factor in how all of that plays out. I think, again, this is kind of a hard balance to find, but most of my professors were male, and most of my professors were actually white men. And so I think having a more diverse spectrum of voices will also give more opportunity for people who have experienced things like this that are still in the journalism world to be able to offer advice to students, because again, they just weren't coming from a place that they necessarily had something that would have made them more predisposed to receive that hate. So I think those two things structurally are part of it. As far as trainings, I'm not aware of any specific trainings that have been set up. But I think like if journalism professors were able to go through some kind of like certification or training in social media and how to help prepare their students for social media, that would be extremely beneficial. Having any kind of social media journalism classes where not only are students taught how to use social media to be beneficial, they can also be taught the pitfalls of how to deal with that and given resources and advice kind of along the lines of what I said to begin with. If they're given that information ahead of time, I think that would be really beneficial. And I would say that should be required coursework for any journalism student, like put that in the core curriculum. Any journalist that is working today is going to have to deal with that. So I think there are so many options. I don't know that they all necessarily exist yet, but I'm also really optimistic that they will. If there aren't, I mean, there may be trainings that I'm not aware of, but if there aren't, I'm hopeful that they become something that people can implement soon. I think that there's a lot of room for colleges and universities to really help prepare students by integrating social media and how to deal with harassment into their curriculum, but that just requires the voices and expertise of people who are currently involved in journalism, and often people who are not what readers are expecting when they see a traditional journalist, whether that's a person of color or someone who's part of the LGBTQ community or a woman or whatever that may be. I think that we need more input from a wider variety of people in order to be able to properly prepare students before they head into those situations.
Taylor, do you have any thoughts, just things you might have picked up from your reporting or from speaking to different young student journalists about things that colleges can do to better prepare these students?
It's hard because I don't think it should be on the students at all. It should be on the colleges, obviously. I mean, I think, of course, I think everything Sarah suggested was honestly great ideas, and I wish that all of that would be implemented. I don't think there's courses. I think it's hard too because a lot of these professors are not like they've been out of journalism for a while, or they're not like they didn't come up in a time of the internet. And I think there's also a lot more young journalists these days, or young people that are interested in journalism that maybe aren't even studying journalism, but and I just would love to see more on ramps for them as well and support. Like there's just so many ways if you start your own podcast or go out and do your own local TikTok interview series or whatever that people can engage in journalism. Yeah, I think that the biggest sort of way to deal with or the best way to deal with online harassment is to have a really strong sense of self. And that's really hard for young people generally because they're still figuring out who they are and they're young. And so I think anything colleges can do to kind of just build people's confidence up as well is really helpful, and just help people sort of like feel grounded, whether that's offering like on-campus therapy resources or doing sort of things like that. I don't know. It's helpful because when you're seeing, especially when young people see all of this horrible stuff said about them online, I think it's easier for them to internalize it because they haven't developed their adult identity yet. So those are just the things that I would add.
Yeah, and I'm curious, and Sarah had already touched on this a little, but Taylor, do you have any strategies that you use for just your own mental health and even like dealing with things like burnout or other just like harms that sometimes come with journalism and especially with online harassment? Because I know for you, especially with your book coming out, all of the reporting that you do, there's definitely as much positive as there is negative. So any strategies that you use to cope with that?
Yeah. I had a complete sort of like breakdown like right before my book came out because all of these trolls had downranked it. Like they went onto all these systems and voted it, and they had been doing that for a while, but it just it made me feel like, oh my God, is my book gonna fail? Like, are they gonna really fuck with me enough that it's gonna fail? Thank God that the opposite happened and everything. I have a very strong readership that I'm grateful for. But I think what helps me in those times is talking to other people that have been through it. Like I just think having a community is so important. And um I don't even have a very strong journalism community, but just living in LA, I've met a lot of other people that work, they're public figures or they work in public facing careers, and they've dealt with bad media cycles or, just like seeing this version of yourself online or in the public or in the media even that's doesn't represent you, and so I think just like, yeah, having people you can vent to and talk to that can be like, oh, I felt the same. Like I had a movie come out and I was in the midst of this scandal and I thought it would never end, but I made through it. But like even if it's not people that, because sometimes it can be hard to find other journalism friends. I wish we had more like support groups for women journalists, but anyone you can find that's been through similar kind of things or dealt with hate and harassment is just, it's helpful. Um, just to kind of feel less alone, and also just to remind yourself that ultimately like you'll get through it. I actually think the worst of it for me was like in 2020 when the place I was working at was so difficult and unsupportive, and I think that now at least my current editor and everything, and my editor at my old job was also supportive. It was more just like the bosses people, but that's also really important too, like having a strong support system, even if it's just you're publishing something from your student newspaper, like having people, if it's your direct editor or other people there, like sharing your story, boosting you, helping you get through it so that you don't feel like you're going out on a limb or I don't know. So, but it's psychologically difficult to deal with, and I feel again I think it's just so much worse for young people because they're still figuring out who they are,
Yeah, I think young people are extremely online, to quote Taylor's book. I just think we're all so like, our lives are so integrated with our digital lives that it makes it hard to separate the two. So I wanted to just bring up a couple resources for folks. A few that come to mind that I've definitely looked into before that I've seen be really useful for newsrooms or students include the PEN America Digital Safety Training. The International Women's Media Foundation as well offers resources for women journalists facing online harassment. And as always, the Student Press Law Center has a free legal hotline should you have any legal issues that you might want to bring up with the SPLC attorneys. But there's definitely, those organizations offer a lot of different comprehensive guides, resources that have looked into the digital safety training that PEN America offers. I think all of these are really helpful for young people to just even look at, even if you might not be facing online harassment at the time, but just to prepare yourself and to kind of see what's out there. I mean, I think all of those resources are really great, and I highly recommend those if folks want to check that out. But um, I think going into, feel free to drop questions into the webinar, and Josh just put a link to the PEN America resource in the chat. But I see Savannah asked a question, and I think this was based on something Sarah was saying. I like what you said about asking potential future newsrooms about what they would do if a reporter was harassed. What do you think student journalists should look for in newsrooms when it comes to this?
Oh my goodness, this might be my favorite question. So when I think it kind of came about pretty naturally for me because I had to explain why I left my previous job. And so I asked a couple of different questions. I would ask about how they would deal with a situation like that, if they had dealt with a situation like that in the past and what they did to help protect that journalist. The other thing that I would ask was, what does success look like to you and how are those metrics measured? Because for the newsroom that I was at, the primary method that we were defined by was clicks. So the more engagement we got, and I think that's true for a lot of newsrooms, but the more engagement we got, our raises, our employee reviews were directly and only tied to that. And so I actually learned this after, but the newsroom I was in, while a lot of newsrooms kind of turned off the comment feature under articles because people got so nasty in the comments, I actually found out that ours like kept it going for 5 to 10 years beyond what most newsrooms did because it drove engagement. So I think for me, I very quickly learned that finding a newsroom that understands that engagement is important, because it will always be important no matter what newsroom you're in, because you want people to read your work. But finding a newsroom that understood the difference between engagement and exploiting reporters for clicks and for, like, it didn't matter who said what, it didn't matter what was being shared as long as it was being shared. So if somebody were to put out an article and like retweet it, but say like Sarah is like, excuse my language, but like Sarah is a bitch and she doesn't know what she's talking about, which people did say. I had someone write that in a column and call me a female dog tied up in the yard barking at nothing. Like, I think that understanding very, very, very early on the way your performance will be evaluated and what that has to do with engagement metrics is crucial when you are going into a newsroom. And that was the number one question I asked in every interview. I think that every single time you interview, someone's going to say what they would do if a reporter was harassed, and they're going to say that they would be supportive, because who wouldn't say that? I think if they have been in a situation where a reporter has gone through that and they've handled it in a specific way, that's really helpful. But I think one thing that you can do to try and narrow that down would be like, what specific action steps would you take if a reporter was placed, or if a reporter was put in this situation? Like, what are 3 things that you would do to support them? What like legal ties do you have? I know that my organization had lawyers available if you want to go that route. I've not asked that, but you could. Like, you can really take it as far as you want. But I think for me, the big thing that I always drove home was like, where's the difference between a reporter's success and people reading their work and like pushing their work to be successful among a large group of people, and putting that reporter out essentially as like a target. And if, as long as they get the engagement, like, who cares what's said about them? So that was a huge thing for me, and I cannot recommend that enough when you're speaking to a potential employer.
Yeah, and I'm curious because Taylor, you've worked at some of the biggest, I guess, legacy news outlets in the country. What do you find that you value in a newsroom, and what did you kind of see wasn't working for you when you worked at these different places?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I just don't recommend anybody go into legacy journalism at this point. Not only is it incredibly unstable economically, and like everyone's getting laid off anyway. Um, I don't know a single legacy newsroom that's supportive. Thank God I have my editor. My editor, Mark Seibel, shout out. I would die for this man. Like, he is the reason that I'm at the Washington Post. Because without him, I mean, before he was my editor, there was like a couple months before he was my editor, and I thought I was gonna quit, like, because there was no support. Um you know, Mark is just amazing and is so supportive and always has his reporters' backs. And most bosses aren't like that, unfortunately. Most bosses just report to another boss that's whatever, you know, and you can't trust these institutions. No institution will ever have your back. I don't think any of them are living in our current century. Like, I honestly, I think they're operating on totally, I don't even know how to like have these conversations. I mean, just basic safety conversations. Like, I mean, I've dealt with a lot with my family and family members being harassed and stalked and stuff. And I mean, I've had my employer try to put out information about me and my family members, like put endanger me. Like it's like it's not even it'd be bad enough if they were just ignoring it, but they've actively made it worse in certain situations. And um so yeah, I just say try to avoid traditional media as much as possible, and and which you should do when you're young anyway. You don't want to work at these ancient places for people that are out of touch and approaching retirement. Like they're just not. And I said my editor is 72, by the way. He's amazing. I'm not like saying as an age thing. It's more of this like legacy media mentality where they don't understand how the internet works. And you have to understand how the internet works in order to protect your journalists. Otherwise you get, oh, just like log off, or what's that famous tweet? Who posted that was like, how are you going to be cyberbullied? Like just close your computer or something, or turn off your phone. Like that's their like understanding of online harassment. And it's it's so much more pervasive than that. Like Sarah said, it's not, you can delete all your social media and still get harassed. Like you being on the internet doesn't you removing yourself doesn't even stop it. It just takes away your voice and your agency, and that's always their default. That's always their default. Or it's, I mean, I've seen a lot of this young journalists, this happen to them because like they know they don't have a like a personal brand. I hate that word, but like personal brand yet. So people don't really know much about them, and they're very quickly framed as controversial. So they'll do one story that kind of makes people angry, and then suddenly they're controversial, and they're seen as controversial, and their newsroom begins to think, oh, we've got this controversial reporter. Meanwhile, they just wrote a story. They're not, the controversy is manufactured around them. So yeah, I don't even remember your original question, but I just think I don't know a single legacy newsroom that's doing it well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like really trying to think, is there one? No. Rolling Stone, maybe a little bit, because Noah Shackman always, I worked for him at the Daily Beast. Like he's known for supporting his journalists and letting journalists do stories they couldn't do otherwise, but he's now just left. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do see the news about kind of the state of the media industry right now, and it's definitely very just alarming, discouraging. So to end on just a more positive note, um, this is a more general question, and it's about student press freedom. Um, but I want to hear from both of you, just one of one of the reasons that you kind of in your, whether it's in your work now as a professional journalist or in the past as a student reporter, um, how you think student journalists are important and ahead of the election in this really important time right now. Just your thoughts on that. We can start with Sarah.
This is one of my favorite questions because this is one of my favorite experiences. So Gary Green, who's now the director of the Student Press Law Center, when I was working for him in the Center for Sustainable Journalism, another reporter, this actually has to do with what Taylor mentioned earlier about people who aren't in the journalism program but want to learn. He was a PR student. I don't even remember what his job was there, but he worked there. And he said he had been wanting to get into reporting. So he said it very offhandedly, and I took it very literally, and I was like, okay, let's do this, let's go. So I asked him what he was interested in, and he said food trucks. And I was like, great, let's do it. So we went and we were looking at different food trucks in the area to maybe do a feature, and he came across this Instagram post that said they were having some kind of food truck advocacy day because they needed this specific assistance that they weren't getting. So essentially it was that they had to have a permit to operate in each individual county in Georgia, which Georgia has an absolutely insane amount of counties compared to every other state that I've lived in. We have like 48 in South Carolina, and Georgia has like 159. So there were just tons. But they had to get a different permit, and they had to go through all of these steps. And so we talked to quite a few different food truck operators and owners that said they were breaking even or coming up in the negatives from having to deal with this. And so I was teaching this reporter, like as a student, trying to teach him how to write and report this story. But basically, we learned that for the last 3 years, people had been trying to get this turned into a bill at the state legislature. And so we were able to talk to them about kind of what they were hoping for. And it got enough traction. Our story went out and people just really, really liked it. It ran in a bunch of different publications. And people were invested enough that they got the traction to introduce that bill. And so, I mean, I'm not sure how familiar a lot of people are with watching the legislative process, but it can take a really long time for a bill to get passed. It can come back session after session. But this particular bill went past both chambers unanimously. So by the end of the session, it was going to be put into law, and they were able to operate throughout the whole state with just one permit. And that, I think, was, I had to like sit him down and be like, okay, I need you to know this is not how every journalism story goes. Like, this is a great experience, but it's not like the norm. But it was so cool to see someone who, I think he was a sophomore at the time, but to see the impact and to have these people that were calling us like, this is literally life-changing, and we couldn't have done this if this article didn't run. We saw people cite it on the chamber floor when they were talking about passing this legislation. And that came from student journalists, which was just incredible to me. I think it cannot be overstated the amount of power that student journalists have. And when you've got a mentor that believes in you and has set students up to be successful and to work with other publications in the area, like, student journalists are tenacious and they're excited and they're innovative and they've got different ideas than the people that are ahead of them. And they are doing some of the best work in journalism right now. And I do not say that lightly. So you can absolutely bring change about while you're a student journalist. You can make an impact, whatever that looks like for you. You can absolutely be successful and so needed as a student journalist, 110%.
Yeah, I'll just echo literally everything Sarah just said. I think student journalists are ahead of the curve, and they're sort of like the next, generation. It's really important to cultivate them as a group, and for young people to also understand. I think that, I think there's a lot of credentialism in the journalism industry and a focus on, you feel like you have to be writing for your student paper to be a student journalist, or you have to have an internship somewhere, whatever. And I just think that's not what journalism looks like anymore. And, don't doubt yourself or feel like you're not, just because you don't have that sort of like corporate seal of approval on you, that you can't make change. Because so many, I read about online influence, but like so many bills getting passed, so many things that, like Sarah mentioned earlier, like even local landlords and stuff. I saw this young person with a TikTok that they were doing all this reporting on local landlords, and they had gotten, actually, I think a regional paper ended up picking it up, basically just citing all their reporting. But, you can make a real difference, even if you're just doing your own podcast or your own writing on a blog or whatever. You can have more impact than you think. So
Yes, so I am a student journalist, but also I just want to echo everything. Right now, so we're in the week leading up to Student Press Freedom Day. Student journalists do a lot of instrumental reporting, so I highly recommend going to studentpressfreedom.org or splc.org. And for anyone interested in getting involved, there's lots of ways to get involved with student journalism. I'm not a journalism major, and I still do a lot of journalism work. So I think it's possible for anyone who has a passion for it, who's passionate about democracy and using their voice, to really get out there and get involved. With that, I think I want to take a moment and thank our panelists, Sarah and Taylor. Sarah, you do incredible reporting. I saw your climate column, she just launched a climate column today. So give that a read. She's doing a lot of really important work on the ground. And Taylor has been an incredible mentor to me, but she also just does a lot of amazing tech reporting. So highly recommend reading Taylor's book, Extremely Online, looking at her stuff as well. And looking at the Student Press Law Center and the work that we're doing. I'm very proud of it. There's a reason I've been involved with this organization for as long as I have been. And so, yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Happy Student Press Freedom Day coming up. And we will be probably sending out some of these resources as well later on.